to work. Everyone listen to go. Thank you.
The House will come to order.
Hi, my name is Edward Howard McWhirter. My purpose here today is to begin a process whereby we can eliminate medical murder for organs in the United States of America. My wife presented at Allegheny General Hospital, the West Penn Allegheny Health System, on 1/13/2011 with cardiogenic pulmonary edema, which in lay terms means she had fluid in the lungs due to new onset heart condition, new onset atrial fibrillation, heart condition of atrial fibrillation caused by about 13 years of Darvocet prescriptions, which had just been recalled on 11/19/2010 by the FDA. When they recalled the Darvocet, this had an adverse effect on Rita, who then presented to the hospital emergency room, Allegheny General Hospital, on 1/13/2011, at which time she was diagnosed with cardiogenic pulmonary edema. She was given Lasix for the fluid in the lungs. She was sent home 2 days later on the 15th of January 2011. She missed 1 day of work, maybe 2. So the problem was atrial fibrillation, new onset, for which they prescribed her. First time caused by about 13 years of Darvocet prescriptions, which had just been recalled on 11/19/2010 by the FDA. When they recalled the Darvocet, this had an adverse effect on Rita, who then presented to the hospital emergency room, Allegheny General Hospital, on 1/13/2011, at which time she was diagnosed with cardiogenic pulmonary edema. She was given Lasix for the fluid in the lungs. She was sent home 2 days later on the 15th of January 2011. She missed 1 day of work, maybe 2. So the problem was atrial fibrillation, new onset, for which they prescribed her first time heart medication of metoprolol tartrate, 12.5 milligrams a day, which proved to be too low a dose. They sent her home on the 15th, and she went back to work. During this intervening time between January 15th and her next presentation to the ER, the same ER, Allegheny General Hospital, on 2/1/11. During this intervening 2-week period, she was scheduled to see her PCP, Dr. Husseini, Syed Rashidullah Husseini, in Bellevue on Lincoln Avenue, approximately the 17th of January, at which time she had her normal visit with him. After which she had called him and told Husseini that the heart medication was not working. Her lungs were filling back slowly with fluid. Instead of changing the medication dosage, he told her to take it a different time of day, which she did. It had no effect, and she kept on having problems. She could tell her lungs were filling up with fluid again. Even though when I checked it, it was hard to hear because I was not trained in how to listen for that type of thing. So, during this 2-week period, she notified her PCP that the medication was not working. The new onset atrial fibrillation was still causing her problems. She could feel it coming on of the fluid in the lungs. And this proceeded to end up at a time on wee hours in the morning of February 1st, 2011, around 5:36 a.m. She woke me up and immediately fell on the floor and passed out. Her breathing was very slow, which means that when she passed out, her metabolic need for oxygen was greatly decreased, which is a natural defense mechanism of the body. When you pass out, it shuts down all the unnecessary systems, such as movement. But her, so she was breathing slowly. I called the paramedics. Paramedics came 15 minutes, something like that, 15, 20. And I told them what happened, and I told them that two weeks previously, on the 13th, she had the same problem, but we caught it in time and she hadn't passed out. At which time, they gave her Lasix and sent her home from Allegheny General Hospital emergency room. The second time she went in to Allegheny General Hospital emergency room was on the February 1st, 2011, where they proceeded not to give her Lasix for her condition, and the attending physician, Ghazala Bigdeli, was informed by me many times, along with Sandeep S. Rana, the neurologist. I informed both of these doctors that she was in there previously for cardiogenic pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, and I told them she needed Lasix. I told Rana repeatedly the morning of the emergency room, at the emergency room, that she needed Lasix. I kept asking him if they gave her Lasix, and he kept ignoring my question. I also talked in conferences with Ghazala Bigdeli, Dr. Ghazala Bigdeli, about the fact that she needed Lasix because she had cardiogenic pulmonary edema. At which time, Bigdeli would keep blowing me off on this matter. So I knew something was up. Now, there was another doctor, Dr. Ward, a cardiologist, at the emergency room. I kept asking him, I kept telling him the situation, that she needed Lasix and all that kind of thing. And he told me, contrary to what Bigdeli and others were telling me, that there was apparently nothing wrong with her according to the EEG. There was no infarction of any kind. Everything looked like she's going to make a full recovery. This is Dr. Ward, the cardiologist. I believe he may have been a resident at the time. I kept telling him the situation about the Lasix and everything, and he kept telling me, reassuring me that everything looked okay. Now, his story changed later on in a conference with Big Deli and other medical personnel at one of the conferences. They convinced him to go along with the idea that she was in a coma, even though Big Deli would never tell me that she was in a coma. But they just said she had low voltage. Well, low voltage can be caused by many, many things, including untreated fluid in the lungs. Okay, if you don't treat fluid in the lungs, you're not going to have enough oxygen, and therefore you're going to have a low voltage of on the EEG just due to lack of oxygen. Now, so to sum up, she presented on January 13th with cardiogenic pulmonary edema. They gave her Lasix, they sent her home. In the interim, two-week interim between then and February 1st, her medication was not working. She informed her PCP, he did not change the dosage, and she continued to go downhill until at last, on February 1st, she had to go to the emergency room again. At this point, she had passed out, which she did not pass out before. It's the only difference. Her heart was beating slowly, so she was apparently getting enough oxygen for her brain. Otherwise, her body would have made her breathe more quickly. So she was breathing very slowly after she passed out, so everything seemed fine. All she needed was get the fluid out of the lungs, which they never did until 2 weeks later when they were forced to, because they had to trach her or not trach her due to the hospital rule. You have to trach or not trach somebody after 2 weeks. So when they were forced to trach her, which only one doctor was willing to trach her because it was commonly known amongst the doctors that there was actually nothing wrong with her except for untreated fluid in the lungs, for which they never gave her Lasix until they had to right before the operation. They would have to clear it out to do the trach operation, which was done by Dr. Sherry A. Mancini on the 16th of February. They gave her a dose of Lasix on the 14th of February in preparation for this operation, at which time Rita was able to open her eyes, and well, actually she didn't open her eyes, she just started crying. And she kept on trying to talk, but she couldn't talk because when you have a ventilator tube down your throat, you cannot talk. It doesn't allow your voice box to function when you have a tube down your throat. So she kept crying and turning purple every time she tried to talk. When they gave her Lasix, that cleared up her lungs, which made her come to a point where she could move around. Even at that time, she couldn't open her eyes. Didn't have enough energy to open her eyes, but she could move. She could move. And so when they gave her the Lasix, she started to come around. And she started crying because she kept on trying to talk to us, tell us what was going on. And that's why her face would turn blue every time she tried to talk. We thought she was just trying to swallow, but actually she was trying to talk. And she kept on crying, tears streaming down her face. Half with happiness, the prospect of being allowed to come around and get out of this situation. And bottom line is, she started coming around when they gave her the Lasix, because the only problem she had was fluid in the lungs, which was causing this quasi-semi-comatose looking situation, which is just was only caused by lack of oxygen due to not treating the fluid in the lungs with Lasix. So she came to with the dose of Lasix they gave her on the 14th of February for the 16 February operation of tracheostomy. That's when she came around. She was crying. Okay, so on the 16th, they gave her the tracheostomy operation. Okay? At which time, after the trach, she came back, and she was set on a ventilator rate of 12 breaths per minute, 12 breaths per minute, like 600 milliliters tidal volume for every breath, which is like about 16 times what she needed. Okay. Because at this time her lungs were cleared out, so instead of subduing her by not treating the condition she had of fluid in the lungs with Lasix, since they could not do this anymore, so they knocked her out by hyperventilating her with too many breaths, with too large amount of oxygen per breath. A person, if somebody has nothing wrong with them, they're only going to need like 150 milliliters, maybe an average of eight breaths per minute, something like that. 12 breaths per minute with 600 milliliters tidal volume per breath is going to knock you out. I don't care who you are, okay, if there's nothing wrong with you. So let me just reiterate real quickly. The first time she presented in January, they diagnosed her with cardiogenic pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs due to atrial fibrillation, for which they gave her the first time heart medication. When she presented again with the same condition, but slightly more advanced, because she was passed out but still breathing slowly, in February, when she presented again, they would not give her Lasix, even though my repeated attempts to get them to give her Lasix, they never did. Of course, I didn't know this until I looked at the records that I got on 13th of May, 2011, which were partial summaries rather than the complete records that I asked for. So what we have here is Rita presented with the fluid in the lungs. They gave her Lasix, sent her home. 2 weeks later, she presents for the same thing with slightly advanced condition, for which they put her on a ventilator. She immediately came to, and then started bucking the vent because she never needed the ventilator. Okay, and they called this vent bucking the vent. They decided to obviously murder her at this point in time on the 1st of February, because if all they had to do was give her a dose of Lasix, all they had to do was give her a dose of Lasix and send her home like they did the first time. Dr. Gosla Bigdelli, the attending physician on February 1st, 2011, she admits that she was bucking the vent. Well, when you buck the vent, that means that you don't need the vent. So instead of removing the ventilator tube and the ventilation process from her, they masked it with propofol, with anti-seizures, and at different points in time for other procedures, paralytics, okay? So the second time they refused to give her Lasix until 2 weeks later when they had to, when they trached her for the tracheostomy operation by Dr. Sherry Ann Mancini. So what we have here is obvious attempt to not treat the condition that she did have, which was diagnosed 2 weeks previously, and Gosla Bigdelli says in the records on my website, readrevolution.com, if you go to the records, you'll see that Gosla Bigdelli admits that she was told by myself about this previous condition in the same ER same emergency room in Allegheny General Hospital. And she says that she could not find this information in her porthole. Well, if you look at my website, you'll see that I found it, so she should have found it too. So obviously there's a cover-up going on right from the very first day of the second admission, February 1st. And they constantly kept refusing to give her Lasix. Okay, and of course, once she's trached, all right, you still need Lasix, okay? The point here is that by not giving her Lasix and telling us that they couldn't find the records of 2 weeks previously, which are shown right on my website, there is obviously a cover-up going on, all right? And if you notice in the records, you'll notice that they pretty much completely ignore the previous diagnosis, which was the correct diagnosis 2 weeks earlier on January 13th. They completely ignore this information, okay? And they keep on trying to manufacture situations such that they can call this anoxic encephalopathy, which it was not. When Rita could talk past this, the tracheostomy will bypass your vocal cords. But Rita found a way, being the hard-headed person she was and a fighter, to speak past this tracheostomy and scream out, "No." One of the first times we saw her after she was trached, she was screaming, "No, no, no." We didn't know what this meant, okay? If I would have known, obviously I would have just taken her home. But since I didn't know, we endured 222 days of basically terrorism, okay? In which she was trying to tell us what was going on, and we couldn't understand what she was saying because it's difficult to speak when your vocal cords are bypassed. So what you have here is you have a patient whose previous correct diagnosis 2 weeks earlier was completely ignored. And the records show this if you go to readerrevolution.com. Just click on the top link and you'll see the records. And I'll be explaining that within the records, step by step, what was going on at each time, if you want to look at that. So the first diagnosis is completely ignored during the whole second admission. On April 9th, which is the day we met in 1993, she was shipped off to the Greenery Specialty Care Center. Okay. But right before this, I had forced them repeatedly to do a CPAP procedure on her because I knew something was wrong. Before the CPAP procedures were forced by me to be done, before this happened, they were kept on trying to get us to pull the plug due to propofol dependency, which was used to mask the bucking of the vent, which they decided to call myoclonic jerking, which would be an indicator of anoxic encephalopathy, but because it was not myoclonic jerking, it was bucking of the vent or hiccups. Because it was just hiccups, there was no anoxic encephalopathy. It was a simple matter. She was jerking because she was forced to have too much oxygen with each breath. By the end of her life, from that point on, after 222 days, she was forced to buck the vent violently, both to the tips of both toes, with with each breath, which ended up being about 4 million breaths of forced hiccups, full body hiccups, jerking to the tips of both toes. Every breath for 222 days straight. And in the interim, having to deal with painful procedures that she never needed because she never needed the ventilator or the trach. She was forced to endure every 4 hours, 6 times a day, aspiration where they put this tube down her throat and she'd turn purple every time. Okay, and they suck his. So, to wrap this up, let me just say what I would like to say. What I need is, I need the medical records, the complete medical records of Rita Joanne Conley, from the very least from 1/13/2011 until her death on September 10th, 2011. Preferably, I would like all her medical records for her time as a patient with PCP Dr. Syed Rashidullah Husseini, who dropped her on February 1st, 2011 as her PCP and handed the job of PCP to his longtime neighbor, Dr. Ronald Octavius Mona, M-O-N-A-H. His longtime neighbor handed the job of what was to be done to him, who he then proceeded to put her in a nursing home in Canonsburg, even though a nursing home cannot treat the condition she actually had, which is cardiogenic pulmonary edema, for which you have to be monitored 24 hours a day, 24/7, constantly monitored in order to treat the heart condition as well as the condition of lack of oxygen. You need to be monitored for oxygen saturation and for heart rate. Nursing home is legally not allowed to monitor you for either of those things 24/7. They only did that once every 4 hours, which is not good enough to monitor the new onset cardiogenic atrial fibrillation that she had. So to sum it up, I can prove that my wife, Rita Joanne Conley, was murdered by West Penn Allegheny Health System intentionally by use of medical fraud, which I can prove even from the sparse records that I was given. The records that I was given do not include the anesthesiology report, and they do not include the respiratory report for obvious reasons. I need those reports as well as all the other reports that they did not give me when I asked for them on the 13th of May, 2011. And have repeatedly refused to give me these records. Linda O. Bridges, the Director of Medical Records at Allegheny General Hospital, will not give me these records. Okay. I want all the records of Rita Joanne Conley before and after her time as patient of PCP Dr. Syed Rashidullah Husseini, and I want after that also up until the time of cremation. So I want her complete records during this relevant period of time. Okay. I also want Dr. Ghazala Bigdeli brought up on charges of first-degree murder because the records prove that she intentionally disregarded the previous correct diagnosis of cardiogenic pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, 2 weeks previously, and she kept on repeating she could not find this information in her portal. which is totally ridiculous, okay? Plus, she never gave her the Lasix, even though I repeatedly told Rana and Big Belly that she needed her Lasix, and they kept on blowing me off until I found out in the records of 13 May 2011 that they had not given her the Lasix at all until they were forced to before the trach operation. So what we have here is Rita Joanne Conley was murdered by virtue of medical fraud, ignoring the correct diagnosis while treating a fraudulent, fabricated diagnosis of anoxic encephalopathy, which is proven in the records to be totally false. And I need the complete medical records, which nobody will give to me, and no lawyer anywhere will help me get the records. And I've been told by lawyers I will not get anybody to help me with this, okay? So I want the complete medical records, Rita Joanne Conley, proving medical fraud and murder thereby. I also want Dr. Gazala Bigdelli brought up in charges of murder, first-degree murder, by a fabricated diagnosis and non-treatment of the actual known diagnosis. I want her prosecuted and all other relevant doctors prosecuted, including West Penn Allegheny Health System and West Penn Allegheny Health System, and I also want Allegheny Health System, AHN, to be prosecuted for the cover-up of the same, okay? It was formed on April 29th, 2013. Part of the reason was because of this case. So I want the medical records, complete medical records, during the time that Husseini was her PCP, for how many years that was, and I want after he handed her off to his neighbor, Dr. Mona, I want those records also, and I want the records up until it was the time she was cremated. So I want the records, and I want these people prosecuted for first-degree murder. Thank you. All right.
Sorry about your loss.
Oh, it's not a loss. If it was a loss, it would be okay, but it was a murder.